Anne Boleyn changed the course of English history, but historians can't even agree on when she was born. I'm historian and author Claire Ridgway, and today in this companion video to my Anne Boleyn documentary series, I'm diving into the evidence, from early household roles to contemporary testimonies, to explore whether Anne was born in 1501, 1507, or somewhere in between. How old was Anne when she began her education in Europe? Was she still in her prime as queen when she fell? What does her age tell us about Henry VIII's motivations, political, personal, or both? Without a baptismal record, we rely on scattered clues. Most historians today place Anne's birth around 1501, making her about 35 when executed in 1536. That view has been common since the 19th century and is grounded in her early service as a maid of honour. Others have argued for a 1507 birth date, basing this on two main sources: William Camden, writing late in Elizabeth I's reign, and the memoirs of Jane Dormer, Duchess of Ferrier and a former lady-in-waiting to Mary I. But why does it matter, you might ask? Well, as historian Gareth Russell has explained, Anne's age at the time of her execution fundamentally changes how we interpret the motives behind her fall. If Anne was 28 when she died, she was still well within her childbearing years. Gareth argues that in that scenario, it becomes much harder to believe her execution was driven simply by her failing to provide Henry VIII with a living son. He explains that if she was just 28 in May 1536, the reasons behind her execution become infinitely more sinister. The idea that it was just her failure to produce a son becomes a good deal less convincing. In that case, Gareth points out, it becomes far more plausible that Henry VIII actively orchestrated her removal, eliminating a still viable queen rather than replacing an ageing one. However, if Anne was around 35 at her execution, then by Tudor standards, she was already nearing the end of her expected fertility. In that context, Gareth suggests the explanation shifts. Her downfall looks less like a calculated removal of a still useful queen and more like a political coup driven by court power struggles. He describes it as a savagely brilliant process of character assassination, lies, manufactured hysteria, and a ruthless palace coup organised by the king's chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell. So the difference is not just numerical. It changes the entire moral and political reading of 1536. Anne, aged 28, implies a more deliberate chilling decision by Henry. Anne, aged 35, supports a narrative of factional politics and opportunism. Gareth's perspective highlights why historians care so deeply about her birth year. Anne's age reframes whether we see her death primarily as dynastic anxiety or as cold political elimination. So, with that in mind, the stakes of this question firmly in view, let's examine the evidence. What does the historical record really tell us about whether Anne was born in 1501, 1507, or sometime between the two? Let's begin with the case for a birth date around 1501, which has traditionally been the most widely accepted among historians. One key piece of evidence comes from a letter written by Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, to Thomas Cromwell. In it, he reflects on the early years of his marriage and explains that his wife brought him a child every year. In her biography of Elizabeth Boleyn, née Howard, Thomas's wife, Sophie Backus Waterman dates Thomas and Elizabeth's marriage to between March 1498 and November 1500. So let's say 1499. The Boleyns had 5 children we know of: Mary, Anne, Henry, Thomas and George. So Thomas's letter suggests a cluster of births between 1500 and 1505. If the Boleyn children were born in close succession during that period, then Anne being born nearer to 1501 sits comfortably within that pattern. A second argument for circa 1501 centres on the letter that Anne wrote to her father while serving at the court of Margaret of Austria. Some historians, such as Eric Ives, have noted that the handwriting and tone seem too sophisticated for a very young child. The language suggests someone of around 12 rather than a girl of 7 or 8. Hugh Paget also drew attention to correspondence between Margaret of Austria and her father the Emperor, which indicates that the expected age for a maid of honour in her household was around 13 or 14. If Anne had been born in 1507, she would have been only 6 in 1513 when she went to the court, far below the usual entry age for such a role, whereas a birth around 1501 makes her slightly younger than average, but still within a plausible range, particularly as her father had a close relationship with Margaret. There is also a statement by the 17th century historian Lord Herbert of Cherbury, who wrote that Anne was about 20 when she returned to England in 1521 or 1522. Although Herbert was writing much later, his remark does at least reflect a tradition that Anne was considered a woman of around 20, not a teenager at that time. But perhaps the most persuasive practical argument concerns Anne's appointments in France. Anne was chosen to accompany Mary Tudor when she became Queen of France in 1514. This was a prestigious and sensitive court position. It required social polish, education, emotional maturity, and the ability to function within complex court etiquette. It is difficult to imagine a very young girl, say around 7, being selected for such a role. And it's worth emphasising that Anne was not simply selected for Mary Tudor's entourage and then sent home again. After Louis XII's death, she was retained at the French court in the service of Queen Claude, Queen Consort of the new King Francis I. That continuity of service suggests not a decorative child presence, but a young woman considered capable and useful within a royal household. Finally, there is Archbishop Matthew Parker's later comment that Anne was Norfolk born. Now, he was a chaplain of Anne Boleyn, so he knew her well. If Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn moved permanently to Hever by about 1505, then an earlier birth date better fits the idea that Anne was born while the family was still closely associated with Norfolk and at Blickling Hall. When these strands are taken together, they create a coherent picture, a likely birth window around 1501, with Anne already at an age considered to be a young woman by the time she emerged onto the European stage. However, as I've said, not all historians have agreed with that earlier date. For many years, there's been a strong and at times passionately defended case for 1507. This argument rests primarily on 2 later testimonies. The first comes from William Camden, Elizabeth I's official historian, who wrote during the final years of her reign. Camden explicitly recorded Anne Boleyn's birth year as 1507, even writing it in Roman numerals, which suggests he intended it to be precise rather than approximate. Camden also had access to materials from William Cecil's archives, so his statement cannot be dismissed lightly. The second source is the later memoirs of Jane Dormer, Duchess of Ferrier, who served Mary I. Dormer claimed that Anne was not yet 29 at the time of her execution. If taken at face value, then that would also place Anne's birth around 1507, 1508. Other strands of evidence have also been used to support a later birth date. For example, Thomas Boleyn referred to Anne as La Petite Boleyn in 1514, a phrase which some historians, notably Reuther Warnock, have taken to imply that she was still a very young girl at that point. Margaret of Austria herself described Anne as so pleasant for her young age, a phrase that some scholars have interpreted as suggesting a child closer to 7 or 8 than to 12 or 13. Comparisons have also been made with other young girls of high rank, such as Anne Brandon, daughter of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, who is believed to have joined Margaret of Austria's court at a similarly young age, suggesting that Anne Boleyn's early placement abroad may not have been unique. Gareth Russell has also noted that when Anne Boleyn travelled from Hever to Brussels in 1513, she seems to have been escorted only by the courtier Claude Bouton, with no female chaperone being mentioned. If Anne had already reached the canonical age of 12, the point at which she was legally considered a woman, a female companion would normally have been expected, and the absence of one may imply that she was still a child. It has also been observed that during the debates surrounding Henry VIII's Great Matter, none of his opponents appear to have criticised Anne on the grounds of age or declining fertility, an omission which some historians find easier to reconcile with a woman in her early 20s rather than her late 20s. For many years, Gareth Russell, among others, found these converging testimonies compelling. All these points suggesting that Anne was only 28 when she died in 1536 are not easy to ignore. However, the two main sources, Camden and Dormer, present difficulties. Both Camden and Dormer were writing after Anne's lifetime. Their accounts belong to the world of memory, court tradition and retrospective storytelling. They may reflect genuine oral history, or equally they may echo assumptions, repetition, or attempts to shape narratives about Anne and her daughter Elizabeth. They are valuable, but they're not contemporary. And as Gareth himself has acknowledged, the more closely one compares these later testimonies with the surviving evidence from Anne's own lifetime, the harder it becomes to rely on 1507 with confidence. Nonetheless, the appeal of the 1507 theory has been strong, not least because, as we've seen earlier, a younger Anne radically reshapes the emotional and political reading of 1536. More recently, however, new thinking has begun to emerge, particularly from Gareth's close study of court household structures and the ages at which young noblewomen entered service. In a debate on Anne's birth date between me, Dr. Owen Emerson, and Gareth Russell that I held for one of my events, Gareth explained that one of the turning points for him came from examining evidence from Jane Seymour's household in 1536, Queen Jane Seymour. Lady Lisle petitioned for her daughter Anne Bassett, born in 1522, to be admitted as a maid of honour. Jane Seymour refused because Anne Bassett was only 14. A year later, when she was 15 or 16, Anne Bassett was accepted. This suggests, as Gareth explains, that in practice, the normal entry age for a maid of honour at the English court was around 15 to 16, not 13 or 14. If Anne Boleyn entered Catherine of Aragon's household in late 1521, early 1522 on her return from France, a 1507 birth would make her about 14, unusually young by comparison, and a 1501 birth would make her 20 or 21, unusually late to begin such service. Both extremes strain the norms of Tudor household culture. A mid-range birth year, around 1504 or 1505, resolves that tension neatly. It places Anne at around 15 to 17 when she entered royal service at the English court, exactly the age bracket that fits the household precedents. This middle window also fits the spacing of the Boleyn children implied by Thomas Boleyn's letter. It allows for Anne to have been old enough for her letter to her father to display emerging sophistication, but still imperfect French, and makes sense of her selection for Mary Tudor's French entourage, and still leaves open the possibility of a Norfolk birthplace. It also avoids two extremes, Anne being implausibly precocious if born in 1507 or implausibly late to court if born in 1501. In other words, a birth year around 1504 to 1505 smooths out many of the chronological and developmental anomalies created by either of the traditional dates. However, and this was something all of us in the debate emphasised, the evidence remains fragmentary. None of these conclusions can be regarded as definitive. New discoveries or even new interpretations could shift the picture again in the future. But as things currently stand, the mid-range date increasingly appears to offer the most balanced reconciliation of the surviving evidence. And I'm kind of in the middle. I'm not sure. I'm traditionally with 1501, but Gareth is convincing me. So, was Anne Boleyn born in 1501, 1507, or somewhere in between? The truth is, we simply don't know for certain. The surviving evidence is tantalising but incomplete, and every possible birth year brings its own implications for how we understand Anne's upbringing, her time abroad, her rise at the English court, and even the meaning of her downfall in 1536. What this debate really reveals is not just a question of dates, but the nature of Tudor history itself, a world reconstructed from fragments, biases, memory, traditions, and the occasional lucky survival of a letter or passing remark. If only Thomas Boleyn had written down the dates of his children's births in the family Bible or Latin dictionary like his grandson-in-law Sir Francis Knowles did. But now I'd love to hear your view. Do you lean towards 1501, 1507, or does the 1504-1505 middle ground make the most sense to you after hearing the evidence? Do let me know your thoughts and your reasoning in the comments. I always love seeing how you weigh up these sources. And if you enjoy these deeper dives into Tudor scholarship and would like to explore even more behind the scenes research, sources, discussion notes and companion resources to my Anne Boleyn videos, you might like to consider becoming a channel member. Depending on their tier, members receive extra downloadable materials and additional insights that don't always make it into the main videos, especially for topics like this where the evidence is complex and developing. You'll find the join button beneath this video if you'd like to support the channel and access these extras. And if you're already a member, thank you so much for your support. It genuinely helps me to continue producing this kind of in-depth content. I'll see you soon. Thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.